Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast.
Welcome back to New Jersey Criminal Podcast. Today is the end of the first week of the trial of United States of America versus Ghislaine Maxwell. Opening arguments began on Monday, and the first witness that the government called was the pilot for Jeffrey Epstein, Larry Vasosky. And we've heard testimony throughout the week, and the one thing that I found very interesting was the connection to New Jersey. And here today to talk to me about that connection is Enterprise reporter for The Record and USA Today, Christopher Maag. Christopher, welcome.
Hi, Meg. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining me. So, like many of us, I have been glued to the news watching the development of the trial this week. And obviously, because of the federal rules, unlike state trials where you might have court TV or other live broadcast, the reporters are allowed in the courtroom to some limited extent, but the trial can't be, recorded or rebroadcast. So we are all relying on reading articles about the reporters who are there and their observations. And I found it interesting that the first witness was a pilot. Now, the indictment, the superseding indictment against Ghislaine Maxwell charges 8 counts, the first 6 of which involve allegations that she and others trafficked minors or conspired to traffic minors. Obviously, in order for the government to prove those charges, they have to prove that there was actual trafficking or traveling. And so one of the big topics throughout the initial arrest of Jeffrey Epstein at the Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, and a lot of articles since then have focused on his travels on his infamous Boeing 727, commonly known now as the Lolita Express and other aircraft. I was doing a little bit of research and I came across your article from 2019, August of 2019, where you described the Teterboro Airport and how it really was the travel hub of his sex traffic ring. So I appreciate you joining me today to give us a little bit of the background that you learned when you first wrote that article back in 2019 and anything that you've learned since then, because it really does seem that this international travels by Epstein, there's been testimony just this week about Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, Bill Gates, etc. A lot of it, a large majority of it, was them flying in and out of this airport in New Jersey. So why don't you tell us about it?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I was similarly drawn to this case. I'm not in my journalism typically drawn to celebrity cases like this, but I found the facts of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged abuses and then the way that he largely escaped consequences for his first conviction in Florida on multiple charges of sex trafficking, gripping and dark and awful. So when Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in the summer of 2019, I was actually out of the country. I was on a writing fellowship up in Canada, literally on the side of a mountain in the Canadian Rockies. And so I was struck by, I've read about this guy. He was arrested at Teterboro. The Record newspaper where I'm based did 1 or 2 short stories on that, but didn't really, it's a daily newspaper with people who are operating under the gun of deadlines. And so nobody had really the bandwidth to think what a remarkable thing this is. What occurred to me immediately is that Epstein, from what little I knew at the outset, liked to be a big deal. He had a lot of money, and he liked to show that he has a lot of money. And for people with those 2 qualities, Teterboro is an important place. To hangar an airplane at Teterboro costs $60,000 a month if you want to park it inside. And there's a long waiting list. And Epstein, just through a quick search I did while I was in my little cabin in the mountains, he had at sometimes 4 aircraft parked there. Some indoors, some outdoors. That's a lot of
By my
money.
math, $250,000 a month.
Yeah. And it wasn't all indoors, and we had a Sikorsky helicopter that was outdoors and things, and one was a small 2-propeller Gulfstream plane. So, yes, but at least one parked indoors. I mean, he was spending a lot of money. He could have parked these planes at Westchester County Airport, just a little bit farther from his home on the Upper East Side, and he could have paid a little more than half. So, being at as context, I had already covered, I was a transportation reporter at the Record before they gave me a column. So I knew a bit, just barely enough to be dangerous, on issues of regional transportation. Teterboro Airport is owned and operated by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So that's why it resonated for me. Like, a lot of people look at Teterboro and they think, it's an airport for small planes in a swamp in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's not untrue, but I knew enough to know that in this, among the international wealthy, Teterboro has a different connotation there. When you are Queen Latifah, I mean, for example, Queen Latifah, Justin Bieber have their photos, Polaroids of them, just inside the door of the subway sandwich shop at the end of the Teterboro runway. Because if you're about to get on a cross-country flight on your own plane, you need a sandwich.
Mm-hmm. One of the places people want to be seen.
Yeah, you want to be able to say that you flew through Teterboro, and for as humble as it looks, it really is a place for the rich and famous. When I got back from Canada, I started looking around, and there had been an earlier case in which Ms. Maxwell had been charged in Florida, and many of the documents, most of the documents from that case, had been sealed by court order, and on appeal, those records were unsealed and open to the public. So I found them online, started going through them, and I was immediately surprised by the volume of flights. These are all, I should describe them, it's a PDF of originally handwritten documents, like a grid, like a spreadsheet, written by just one of Jeffrey Epstein's 6 pilots. This was David Rogers.
I found a copy of that online, and you referenced that in your August 2019 article. I had a question. Did he complete all of the logs, or just the logs for the flights that he was the pilot, Rogers, that is? Because Epstein, just to be clear, Epstein had more than one pilot. Again, first witness called by the government this week was the Larry Visosky. You referenced just a minute ago, I believe, the logs written by David Rogers, who was one of the other, I think, 6 total pilots.
Yes. So each pilot keeps their own log. So David Rogers, these 103 pages, I believe, of sheets of log sheets were just kept by one of Epstein's 6 pilots.
The others didn't keep any logs?
The others may or may not have had logs, but they were not subject to the unsealing decision by the Florida court.
Okay.
So that's a hint of how often Epstein was flying. Just this is presumably a small subset of the total number of flights.
Okay, right. So then your article referencing like at least 730 flights to and from Teterboro between 95 and 2013, it could be much, much more than that.
That's just one pilot of 6. Got
it. Okay.
Right. And the other thing that's maybe interesting to know or maybe important is that these are not FAA required documents. The pilots don't have to keep these. The reason why David Rogers said he kept them is because it is an important piece of information for maintenance of the airplane and insuring the airplane. You want to know how many hours the engines are up and running, roughly how many miles it has flown. And so it's kind of an internal document for the Epstein business operations to say, when does it need a new engine? But it's these things. The reason why that becomes important is because the way that David Rogers kept these records changed pretty drastically. So they start in 1995, and Rogers is writing down, in most cases, the full names of every person on board, with some important exceptions. A lot of what appear to be the younger women that were flying on the Boeing 727 were often just the initials. Mm-hmm. So some of those align with people who say they were victimized by Epstein. Some of them don't, but we just have the initials to go on. So after Epstein was charged in 2007 on sex trafficking, Rogers changed the way he wrote his notes. He stopped putting anyone's full name on. It became either just a hash mark for number of people on the plane or people's initials. So it became a lot more anonymous.
And we don't have any indication at this point whether he did that of his own accord or whether he was directed to do that.
No, we don't know.
I'm sure if he's called to testify, we will find out.
Yes. Yeah, hopefully. So I find it interesting that this otherwise humble place, is this symbol for the international elite. That is a major reason, one would assume, why Epstein chose it to be the focus of his operations. I also should say that there's not a complete Venn diagram overlap here. So we know that from Rogers's other logs, well, the same document that you and I both looked at, mm-hmm. Donald Trump flew on at least one flight. Bill Clinton flew on, I believe, 3 flights, but it's been a little while since I looked. Mm-hmm. None of them went through Teterboro, so I didn't look at them.
Mm-hmm. Right,
so
I
can't
understand.
necessarily
You were
say
focusing
who
on
else
the
was on
Teterboro.
the plane. Yeah. So Teterboro, what else is interesting there?
Well, it seems to me that Teterboro, when Epstein was arrested, he was coming into Teterboro, right? Secret operation. He was arrested. He was flying in from Paris. So the flights going in and out of Teterboro were all over the country and all over the world. It wasn't as though Teterboro just traveled to the Palm Beach residence or the Santa Fe residence. So it was...
Yeah, it was his basis for flights to Paris, to Aspen, Colorado, to London.
Is that so we're assuming, or do we know for sure that the Teterboro Airport is the airport that he would always fly along with Maxwell when she flew with him, anytime they were leaving or coming into the Manhattan residence?
That I can't say with 100% certainty. They did occasionally fly to Westchester, mm-hmm. Usually when Bill Clinton was on the plane.
Okay.
And a couple of occasions they flew to Newark. Mm-hmm. I don't know why. But yeah, it is definitely safe to say that for Epstein's New York home, Teterboro was the base.
Since you wrote the article in August of 19, did you continue your research or investigation regarding the connection to Teterboro? Is there anything that you learned after you wrote the article in 2019 that you felt was worthy of either continued analysis or continued articles?
Yes. So we did, I teamed up with 2 other reporters from the Record, Abbott Koloff and Gene Rimbaugh, who are amazing investigative journalists. And we wrote one more story about Teterboro. And the focus of that story was to talk about this world of it's the world of private aviation, not all of which is for the elite. I mean, this can be crop dusters taking off from grass airports. It can be dentists with a little plane. A small subset of this private aviation world are rich people like Jeffrey Epstein. And the same rules apply to all of them for the same reason, which is you and I are used to getting onto a United flight at pick a major international airport, and we have to go through the TSA screening and our bags are checked. In private aviation, none of that applies. Nobody's checking your bags. Nobody's checking the people on the plane. And the reasoning for that, both from the FAA agrees with the private aviation industry on the argument that owning a plane is like owning a car. We would never suggest that state police should check our bags and our cars before we take our cars out of the garage. Along that same principle, it's a private plane, you own it, you get to take whatever you want. And if through other means we find you are ferrying or trafficking drugs or underage girls, then we have other means to find that and prosecute that. But that private aviation is not the primary lens through which we do enforcement of those problems.
So arguably a privacy interest.
Yes, yeah, that is assumed and implied. That becomes I think because people get a little annoyed at the privileges and power of the rich, when you look at what is actually happening at a place like Teterboro or the Palm Beach Airport where Epstein flew often, these are not the airport experiences that 99% of Americans have. The focus of operations at Teterboro are 5 what are called fixed base operations. And they have a long history in aviation because they actually predated the creation of airports. They predated the word airport. And it just meant, here's a place where you can refuel your plane and get ready for your flight. They have evolved into reasonably opulent way stations, lounges for the rich as their planes are fueled and serviced and ready to go and their crews assemble. So I and a photographer snuck into the fixed base operation that Epstein used. Mm-hmm. It's a nice corporate airport lounge, mm-hmm. With mm-hmm. massaging seats for the pilots. They have bunks for pilots who need to sleep there. They have not an amazing restaurant, but a little restaurant in there. They have leather seats for people to sit in. They have, they make it as nice as you can, as nice as it can be when you're still looking at planes and getting blasted by jet fuel.
Right.
And that's part of the expense of using a place like Teterboro.
A place like Teterboro, I mean, these flights that were taken by Epstein, Maxwell, and others began before 9/11 and extended after 9/11, 2001. Are you aware if any rules changed from the perspective of the FAA post 9/11 with regard to these private planes? In other words, you indicated at the beginning of our conversation that the logs that you reviewed by Rogers, one of the 6 pilots, were not required. That mm-hmm. surprises me to hear that the FAA still wouldn't require some sort of, reporting requirements or knowledge of, private planes flying all over the country or the world.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's really just you need to file a flight plan. That's it.
Okay. Do you know if any of those flight plans have been reviewed by the government or have come into review?
No, I don't know that.
Yeah. It will be interesting, and I'm not sure if either the government or the defense intend to call any of the other pilots. I did review an account of the direct testimony of Larry Visosky on Monday and Tuesday and the cross-examination, and it sounded to me like the defense were pointing to what you said a minute ago about the use of initials of the folks that were on the plane to suggest that perhaps, for example, my initials MH, there could be somebody else with those initials, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I was on that flight, that kind of a thing.
Right.
Not that I've ever been on a private plane, but
yeah, one of the interesting things there is that MH had her own plane.
Right.
There's a, there's a, it wasn't the big 727. It was usually, part of the time it was a Sikorsky helicopter, and part of the time it was a twin prop plane with MH. It's a
GM?
vanity
GM?
license. With GM, sorry,
Right.
yeah.
I don't have a
like
private plane
vanity
as far as I
license
know.
yeah, it's a vanity license plate in the aviation world. If you can pay extra to have your initials as part of your tail number.
Right. In fact, didn't the
Epstein did that for-
Boeing 727, the Lolita Express, didn't it end in JE?
Yes.
Right.
And there was a plane. Sorry, I wasn't saying my point clearly. There was always a plane at Teterboro with GM for Ghislaine Maxwell.
So
Another thing
her
that I
link.
should mention,
So she had her own private plane at Teterboro Airport.
if she owned it or not is unclear, but it appears that it was named for her.
Got it.
Yeah. Another thing that I should mention, maybe I haven't nailed this down specifically. The real issue when you're looking at this case for Jeffrey Epstein is because it's private aviation, there are no rules for security, really. If you're coming in from, as he was on his final flight from Paris, if you're flying internationally, the TSA is allowed to meet you at your destination and check your bags, to make sure you're not bringing in any illegal goods. So that does exist. Domestic flights, there's no authority, there's no structure for that. But there is an informal piece to it. I believe it was Vanity Fair magazine interviewed people at the St. Thomas Airport, which is close to the island Little St. James that Jeffrey Epstein owned, just a short little boat ride away. Mm-hmm. They reported to again, I think it was Vanity Fair, seeing Epstein landing and leaving in the company of many young underage women and getting their noses bent out of shape, thinking that's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. You're old enough to be their father or their grandfather. This is not like landing at Teterboro is not landing at a crop duster airport. There are people there. And if there were people who noticed this strange looking group at St. Thomas, it stands to reason that there would have been people working at Teterboro who noticed the same thing.
Yeah, and just as an aside, the flight would fly correct, from Teterboro to St. Thomas.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, whether or not there would be any witnesses to the, boarding of these folks on the plane. Yeah,
and the Port Authority told us that they offer trainings. They run trainings for workers, and one part of that training is to instruct workers that if you see anything suspicious to indicate drug trafficking or human trafficking, here are the avenues to report that.
Do we know whether there's any surveillance at Teterboro?
I know that there are private security cameras at each of these fixed base operations. Mm-hmm. Port Authority has its own police force, and they patrol the perimeter. Police also help with them at the perimeter, and then TSA has authority to come on site, and the FBI anytime they want. It's definitely nothing as intensive as you might see at Newark Airport.
One of the things that Visosky testified about on, I think it was Tuesday, was that one of the things that he did was pick up luggage and put luggage on the plane and do a number of other things around the home of Epstein, including hooking up, audio equipment, etc. It seems odd that a pilot would be carrying luggage onto a plane, but of course, I guess if you're also transporting underage females, that the less people that see and know who's coming on and off, the better.
Yeah, I interviewed a number of pilots who are, among the elite for this private aviation world. Whose clients own a Gulfstream 5 or a Gulfstream 7 jet. $50 million, $70 million jet. In that world, what these pilots told me is that the client dictates everything. Every aspect of your working life is determined by the whims and taste of the client. Some told me that they were hired through, a chief of staff to a rich client, never met or saw the rich client. They were told when to be in the cockpit. They were in the cockpit at that time. The door was always closed, and the client preferred no contact and maximal privacy. Other pilots told me, actually, no, I'll take that back. The same pilot told me he had a different client who liked to fly to Las Vegas and would ask the pilots and a flight, one or two flight attendants to join the client as they rolled around like big spenders in Las Vegas because he wanted to have a big entourage. Mm-hmm. And would be generally included in the client's social world, at a kind of a junior level. It can run the gamut. So, right. Yeah, the client can say, for whatever reason, you can load baggage or keep away for the baggage. We have other people to do that. It's up to the client.
Right, and I think Visosky also had testified. Again, I'm relying on what I have read by other reporters, but or listened to by other reporters. But it's my understanding that Visosky had testified, that the cockpit door was closed. Of course, on cross-examination, it was brought out that he was never told he couldn't come out. On the other hand, he also testified that he was, close with Epstein, that Epstein, I think, paid for his daughter's, both of his daughter's college education, etc. And then on redirect, the AUSA, Jim Comey's daughter was handling him as a witness, said, well, did your daughters ever give him a massage? And he said, absolutely not. Right. So, it sounds as though the government was, attempting to portray Visosky, again, one of six of his pilots, as being, someone who was close with Epstein, who did a lot for him, more than just what a pilot would do. But when on the plane, stayed in the cockpit, didn't come out. The defense was attempting to show that, he certainly wasn't told to stay in the cockpit, and again, was close with Epstein, but never saw or witnessed anything on the plane, at least when he piloted it. I am interested to see if any other pilots testify, and it would be interesting to see if specifically if Rogers testified, because as we've discussed, we've seen his logs, and he may or may not be able to shed light on the individuals who those initials were to him, and why it was that he, after Epstein was first arrested, changed his quote-unquote reporting style to not include certain initials, right? So yeah, again, at the end of the day, it all centers around the majority, at least according to Rogers' flight records, the majority of the flights came in and out of Teterboro right here in New Jersey.
Yeah, and I think that's, at first I wasn't necessarily believing testimony from Rogers from the first trial in Florida. Mm-hmm. These are not, the 727 is a big plane, but a lot of these Gulfstreams are pretty small, and I was thinking, you have to know who's on the plane if you're the pilot.
Right.
And my pilot contact said, sometimes not. If you're in the cockpit, there is often at least two doors between you and the client. So there is often you've got obviously the cockpit door, but then there's often a little service area where you might have a crew sleeping station, big enough for a bed to just barely lie flat, a bathroom, a kitchen. That is both used by crews during long flights and to prepare meals and drinks for the client. So you've got at least two doors. On Epstein's 727, there were multiple compartments going back, including this living room area with this donut-shaped couch we've learned from this trial. So that makes me less incredulous. I'm really curious to see how the testimony goes in this trial, because it actually is possible for all of this to be happening and the pilot to genuinely not know, and or to say, I don't want to know.
Right.
I'd rather not know.
Right. Do you think that the spotlight that has been put upon these private aircrafts and these, airports, such as Teterboro, might change, either the perception of folks that use these airports? You started by saying this is kind of the rich and the famous, and people want to be seen there, to something that is nefarious, and or do you think that it could ultimately change, federal rules, FAA rules regarding security, etc.? What do you think?
Sure. So after we published our story, two congressmen from North Jersey, it was Representative Josh Gottheimer of Wyckoff and Bill Pascrell of Patterson, introduced legislation to study this issue, to say that there are less stringent security regulations and staff training at Teterboro and similar facilities, and the TSA, the legislation authorized a study. It didn't authorize any kind of fix, to say the TSA needs to study this and see if there are security threats or law enforcement threats because of this private aviation network, and report back to Congress on what they find. So we were happy to have any kind of official response in which members of Congress were agreeing that this seems strange, that we have this large network that operates completely on its own with very limited regulation. Nothing has come of that process. So maybe this trial, and especially the fact that the trial opens with establishing testimony from one of Epstein's pilots, maybe this brings more people talking about this issue. But I wouldn't be surprised if nothing happens, because I think a lot of people, both legislators and regular Americans, would find it, would agree with industry to say, well, do you want cops checking your trunk every time you go for a drive? Mm-hmm. Well, that's my plane. Hands off my plane.
Yeah, well,
that's a pretty good argument. And I haven't heard of anybody, nobody from TSA or even people who have pointed out that this is an issue. Nobody has really pointed out a way to increase security at facilities like Teterboro without infringing on that basic assumption of privacy.
Fascinating. Yeah, that balance between privacy rights and the government's interest in protecting people, that's going to be, I think that's going to be a question that, as it relates to private airlines, private airports, private jets, is we haven't heard the last of it. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me, Chris.
Yeah. Thank you, Meg.
It'll
I really
be interesting.
appreciate you,
it'll be
interested,
interesting to see what else we hear, if Teterboro gets named specifically throughout the trial. If anything develops, I'd love to have you come back.
Sure, I'd love to come back.
I thank you for taking your time this afternoon to shed light into these details that you reported on over 2 years ago.
Yeah. Thank you, Meg. I really appreciate it, and let's keep in touch.
Thanks again for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe anywhere you listen.
For more information about criminal defense in New Jersey, go to hornerlaw.com. That's HOERNER law.com.